Welcome everybody to the third lecture of the seminar Neural Network Architectures at the Towards AI Discord server. Today we are going to talk about structured learning networks. In comparison with the remaining lectures, today we are going to see some really old architectures. Yes, the first three are architectures that are like 40 years old. Why to study such old architectures? Well, first is because they are trained in unusual ways. They don't use stochastic gradient descent to be trained, and they have been around in the field for a long while. And something to keep in mind, particularly from deep learning, is that people study certain neural network architectures, then everybody else went to something else, and certain research scientists keep studying them and improving them, and then end up being mighty useful, and that's how we have the deep learning revolution. So these networks have some things that make them particularly interesting, and it's good to keep studying them for the purpose of reconsidering them later on once hardware improves. Yes, particularly, for example, the Hopfield networks have certain characteristics that make them with a physical metaphor. Yes, so they behave similar to certain characteristics of materials. I do think that when we have quantum computers, then Hopfield networks will become quite interesting as an alternative to memory. And things on that direction. On the other hand, the last item, autoencoder, is a key technology being used continuously these days. And we're also going to see variational autoencoders, which share the name with autoencoders, even though are a very different technique. And the variational autoencoders are an alternative to, from my perspective, to generative adversarial networks that we saw last class, that allows for much better training. And with that, we are going to talk about disentangled representations and neural style transfer again, now in natural language processing. So that's today's lecture. It should be fairly short and to the point. So now, another aspect that I would like to mention also about these structured learning networks is that if you can tap people expert in physics, for example, you can get a lot of mileage regarding them, and that's quite popular these days, as we have many people coming into data science with a physics background. So Hopfield networks are the work of Professor John Hopfield. They have been studied for many years, to the point that, for example, I studied in my own undergrad in '97, so they have been popular for a long while. And so from an architecture perspective, the Hopfield networks are fully connected networks. This is why I like them, and I like to introduce them in a neural network architecture course, because somehow we have the field has coalesced in this idea of multi-level perceptron, right? Things have layers, and one neuron connects to the next layer, and so forth, so on. We may have a little bit of recurrence and loops in RNNs that we're going to see 2 classes from now, and shared weights in the terms of CNNs and other constructs. But the Hopfield networks are very different. Every neuron is connected to every other neuron, which of course brings the question of how do we train these things? Yes, and also what that means, everything is connected to everything. Yes, there is then some idea of a global clock that makes a network, a neuron send its output to other neurons and then receive them, etc. So in the Hopfield networks then, every neuron is valued as -1 or 1 and is fully connected. Yes, that means that the weight matrix is symmetric and there are no loops, no self-links. And this is trained using the Hebbian update rule. And that update rule was very popular in neural networks on the 70s and maybe even earlier, because it has a very strong biological parallelism. And the idea is, to state simply, is that neurons that fire together then have a stronger synaptic connection. Yeah. So with this update rule, what we do is we take the Hopfield network with these fully connected neurons and try to store patterns on them. Yeah. So we try to store a number of patterns in the network, and the capacity of the network is one of the main things you study when you study Hopfield networks. And using this update rule, you say, okay, when I have this two pattern, when I store one pattern, I have these 2 bits that are firing together, then I'm going to update the synaptic way between these 2 neurons to reflect that situation, that these 2 neurons are normally firing at the same time. And likewise, if they are not firing at the same time, then I'm going to decrease the synaptic weight. So what this does, it defines a concept of energy for the whole system. Yes, and with the patterns we are storing into the network, what we want is that the weight matrix becomes a point of lower energy for the whole system. Yeah, so in that regard, is the memories we have are points in which the system doesn't have to do much work. It's a place where the system rests. Yeah. So what this gives us is the possibility to store a number of patterns into the network and retrieve them by setting the neurons as an associative memory. Yeah, so we have a pattern that is maybe a truncated version of one of the patterns that is stored or has some noise regarding them. We set the neurons initially to that pattern when the network has already been trained, and then we let the network execute until it reaches a stable state. And that stable state should be one of these patterns that has been stored. For this to work, the patterns themselves have to be well behaved. They have to have certain mathematical properties. If we put all the patterns into a matrix, if I remember well, the matrix has to be invertible. There is the patterns cannot be collinear and things like that. So you can actually pre-process the patterns we are storing to achieve these properties, and then you can store them. The reason that people in statistical physics were very interested about studying these networks is that they behave the same way as spins on certain materials, particularly glass. Yes, so the energy function that you get for a Hopfield network is the same network as the same energy function as you get for a system of spins in glass. So if you want to know the properties of the physical system, you can study these networks and vice versa. And this is what I can tell you about Hopfield networks. From the seminar I taught in South America, there was some references to recent papers that seems to be doing some deep learning extension of Hopfield networks, we didn't get to see any of those papers presented, but if anybody would like to present them in this seminar, I will be very interested to hearing about it. Somehow, to me, in deep learning, my training included many years doing question answering for natural language processing. I would like to see somebody trying to make something like a large-scale Hopfield network with the whole Wikipedia stored inside, or think of that nature. But we'll see if we'll get to that. I don't see the field going into that direction, but we will see what the future has for us. The next topic is RBMs. So RBMs are normally attributed to Dr. Smolensky from 1986, where he introduced them as another device called a harmonium, which is conceptually a more general version of RBM. I would like to bring attention to this researcher, a very, very unusual career. He did an undergrad in physics, a PhD in mathematics for physics, but now he is world known for his contributions to the linguistic theory of prosody, of how we pronounce words. Yes, call it optimality theory. And that optimality theory, in turn, is derived from his work on the harmonium, the original RBM. So, very, very interesting career. On top of that, he's also a Microsoft associate scientist. Yeah, so a fairly successful scientist. And in these constructs, yes, what we have is a system of two neurons, two layers of neurons, and there are no connections within each layer. Yeah, so we have visible variables and hidden variables. The interesting thing about this device is what do we expect them to do? Yes. What we expect them to do is, again, we have certain data. We activate that data on the visible variables. And then we, again, have an energy function that we define. And we train the weights in the middle so that they minimize this energy. And the idea behind this is that there is a certain statistical distribution in the data that can be captured by the hidden variables. And in general, what we want is, for example, to have more visible variables and less hidden variables. Meaning that of all the things that the features can express, we see on the distribution of data only a few that can be expressed. So by doing that, we achieve dimensionality reduction. The RBMs are an example for a generative method, because we can use them either way. Once the system is trained, we can set these hidden variables, and the system will produce visible variables. In the original harmonium paper, they even use a large set of visible variables and partially observable visible variables. And then what the system is doing is feature imputation. Yes, the system realizes that this information was not observed, but the most likely value for these missing visible variables is set then by the network. The problem with these systems that do generative learning is that they are modeling not only the input, but they're using data to model more than what we need just to solve a problem. Yes, so in machine learning, we see this process in general where people that do generative machine learning come up with very interesting designs and with very nice math behind it, and then variations of those designs that just do discriminative learning become more efficient on the use of data, and therefore overtake them. Yeah, but so the key part of the RBMs is that they were used by, therefore they find latent representations from observed variables. They are very hard to train, yes. They normally train using an algorithm called persistent contrastive divergence that requires Gibbs sampling. And the energy function that it uses is very similar to the Hopfield network. And as I was mentioning, when you have the weight trained, it can also do completion from partially observable values or generate a feature vector for downstream use. And the reason that RBMs are so popular is because they were used by Hinton to train deep autoencoders in the early 2000s, and this is part of what sparked the deep learning revolution. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. So Hinton was a big proposer of RBMs, and in a way he keeps studying them, and this is part of what we got deep learning. But they are so hard to train that Hinton himself has a white paper that you can get from his website of 20 pages of tricks just to train these RBMs. So fast forward 15 years and nobody's using RBMs anymore. Yeah, but I do find the original Harmonium paper quite thought-provoking, and there may be more interesting stuff to be done there than just the RBMs. Okay, so another topic that is very popular even outside neural networks are the self-organized machines from Tuvo Kohonen, also from the 80s. So this is a dimensionality reduction technique, and the intention here is you have these input vectors, and you're trying to learn these weight metrics to produce a feature map, such that then you can map different inputs to locations in this feature map. And this is again done not necessarily a direct Hebbian rule, but a fairly similar concept is that you put an input, then you find the feature map that the neuron on this output that is closer to the input, and then you take the neighborhood around it and update it so it gets closer to that. And if you study SOMs, you get a lot of these graphics that what are showing here is how the weight metrics start modifying itself as you are adding more training data. And the algorithm itself is fairly straightforward. I do find these graphs that are very popular on some papers very confusing, because this is not about the input or the output. These are representation of the weights. Yes, and only in the particular case of a two-dimensional system. So again, these networks are not trained through backpropagation, but through this competitive learning. You have two modes. In one you are training and another are mapping, and can represent new data. And so when you have you update the weight for a neuron at time t, yes, and the system uses this idea of the neighborhood around a sample to decide how to update the weights on the neurons from that neighborhood. These days, I haven't seen many people using SOMs. We had a paper of a deep learning expansion of SOMs in the seminar back in Argentina. What these days people use for dimensionality reduction is t-SNE or UMAP. The thing is that those techniques do not use a neural network architecture. So if you want to do something that does dimensionality reduction as part of something else and is easy to communicate and to interpret, maybe having a sum there my work. All right, so now we get to the most interesting part, the autoencoders. Yeah, so this paper is many aspects is the beginning of the deep learning. It's a science journal on 2006 by Hinton and Salakhutdinov on reducing dimensionality using neural networks. Yes, and these are it's an expansion on the original autoencoders, also known as the MNM architecture. And again, the autoencoders themselves have been around for a while. The idea in the autoencoder is that you are training a network with M neurons in the input layer and the same neurons in the output layer. Yeah, so it's a network that just is trying to produce as output the same as its input. But in the middle between this input and output, we put another layer with a bottleneck. Yes, so we can have M equals to, say, 2000 and N equals to 1000. Yeah, and the same as in the RBMs, what we expect is that of all the data that is available for training, even though it has 2000 different features, only 100 features are enough to capture all the variations, the meaningful variations that happens on the training data. Now, an MNM architecture with only one layer was trainable before deep learning. These days, we can train deep autoencoders using the techniques we saw in the first lecture, mini batches, SGDs, ReLUs, etc. In 2006, we didn't have all those techniques yet, but what we had were RBMs. And what Hinton realized was that he could take these images, say here, 2000 neurons, 2000 features for input, yeah, and train an RBM to reduce that to 1000, yeah. Then, once the RBM was trained, we take our training data, we run them through that RBM, and we will produce, this RBM has 1000 in the hidden layer. So we are mapping each of our input images into these 1000 hidden layer activations. And now we take this and we train a second RBM to go from 1000 to 500, and we train that again to go from 500 to 30. Yes? And this is called pre-training. So once we have these RBMs trained, we can stack them and we can unroll them and stack them in the opposite order. And we got a full network that goes 2000, 1500, bottleneck of 30, 500, 1000, and 2000. Yeah. And that then we can fine tune using stochastic gradient descent, and we get a fairly good quality autoencoder that was deep autoencoder was not available with other techniques at that time. So this is deep autoencoders these days can be trained with stochastic gradient descent directly without resorting to pre-training on RBMs, and they are fairly successful. And once we have these autoencoders, we can use them for a variety of processes. We can use them to remove noise. Yes. We can combine them with convolutional neural networks, as we will see next class. And I do think that they can be useful as a image compression algorithm. And I have a little idea there if somebody wants to work on that. Which involves using something like TensorFlow.js. So if you have a large collection of images, you can train an autoencoder and send the autoencoder first, and then just send the code for the images and use them on a on an image browsing website. All right, so another structured learning technique is the variational autoencoder, which is a very, very tricky topic in the sense of it has the same name as autoencoder, but in reality has very little to do with them, and much more to do with RBMs, and because they are generative systems. They can be trained using stochastic gradient descent. The mathematics of it are quite hard, and so let's dive into them. So instead of taking our data, and encoding them and decoding them as we were seeing in the autoencoders, what we take is we take the data and we try to learn how to produce from that data some stochastic noise. And then from the stochastic noise, generate data. So in that sense, the decoder is more similar to the generator in a generative adversarial network. It takes this stochastic noise and produce samples from there. So the encoder, what it finds is these mu and sigmas for a given training sample. Now, this system that you see here on the left side has this red box, this sample Z, from and that sample is you cannot derive it. You cannot train this end to end. You can train the encoder, but you cannot train the encoder and the decoder together. So what they do to make this work is called the reparametrization trick, where they introduce a sample from just from 0, 1, so an unbiased sample, and they combine that with the mu and sigmas that you are getting from the encoder, and that whole structure is trainable end to end. And these are the things. It's very, very much rooted in information theory. So as you can see, that the encoder uses as its training objective that the statistical difference, the QR divergence between the KL divergence between the samples we are observing and the samples the parameters we are obtaining from the encoder is as close as possible. So our encoder is producing is being able to extract the information that is available on the samples, and then the decoder is able to reconstruct something that is as close as possible to the original data. So these things can be trained end to end, and the good news in comparison to the GANs is that they actually are straightforward to train. So the math is very involved. The cost function is based on probability distance, the chiral divergency, and I do find them, this idea of going to probability distribution with unbiased sampling and things like that has become very popular these days with diffusion models, yes. And they can be trained using SGD. And with this, we can revisit a little bit the disentangled representation learning, because when you have something like an autoencoder, you can say, I want the bits I get in the hidden layer, in the middle layer, to have I want to fix them to have a particular semantics. You remember when we saw neural style transfer last class, we were feeding this latent code to the generator, yeah, and then we were making sure that a classifier can be trained to recover that latent code, which means that the generator was producing a distribution of values such that they reflected the latent code. But we didn't know what the latent code exactly means. We will have to recover that information a posteriori. For example, if we were generating faces, we will find out that a certain value of the latent code involves that the face has glasses. Yeah. In this other technique that is used in natural language processing, using autoencoders with recurrent neural networks that we're going to see later class, yeah, we fix the value of some of these bits to carry a very specific semantics that we know. Yes. So in this example from this paper from 2019, we have a product review. Yes, and we are trying to feed the product, the review, and recover it back. So it's an autoencoder. So the product is great, produce the product is great. And this can be trained using a loss function that just measures the reconstruction error. Yeah. But on top of that, we also add another loss function that sets this S value. Yeah. And that S value we set using training data. So we know that the product is great, it's a positive review. Yeah. And as such, we force the loss, a second loss, to set S to 1 in that case. Yeah. So then, when we want to do this type of style transfer for text, on the inference phase, we fed the book is good, we apply the encoder, and then, because this one has a positive review, we spec S star there to be 1. But then we force S star to be 0. Yes, and we keep the rest of the representation stable, and we run it the decoder, we get the book is boring. Yes. And this is how you achieve style transfer. One of the techniques I know to achieve style transfer on natural language processing. Alright, so... Okay, so some closing remarks. There is a very old technique from like late 80s called symbol recirculation, and I did like it quite a bit when I learned it. And I directed an undergraduate thesis final project that ended up in a paper in 2004 on distributed ontological coding through symbol recirculation. In this technique, the idea is to encode a graph, a semantic graph, and the semantic graph it's encoded in such a way that each little symbol has a small network. They call them short-term memory networks that receives a relation and gives you back the distributed encoding for the nodes that where you will land if you follow that relation in a graph. Yeah. The most interesting thing is how this old paper defines the encoding for a node. Yes, which is something I haven't seen in other work, because it's kind of like a meta aspect. The way they define the encoding for a node is to take all the weights of these small STM networks and feed them through an autoencoder. Yeah. So they're taking the weights of a network as the inputs to another network, and then in the squeeze on the M&M autoencoder, what is in the middle layer of this other thing that they call a long-term memory, not to be confused with the LSTMs, recurrent neural nets, that we're going to see later. What you see on the squeeze on the middle layer is then the representation for the nodes. I think that this architecture was fairly innovative, but I don't think a network can recover the information of these weights there is not available for the other networks, because it's like a meta level. So that's something I wanted to share with you. That paper is actually on the zip file in the extra folder. And something else on autoencoders that I have done more recently is for customer work. I have a patent of using autoencoders over subsequences of characters to categorize credit card transactions. So you may have seen when you receive your credit card statement, you have these very telegraphic short pieces of text that describe the type of the transaction you made. So categorize that into, say, food versus fuel, transportation, and that type of categories is actually quite hard, even for a human. And I found that training an autoencoder over subsequences of characters was producing good results, and that was awarded in 2020 as a patent that is also available on the extra folder. So this is what I have for today, and I look forward discussing with you all in the channel. Thank you very much.